Chapter 4. Gülen, Confucius, and Plato on Education. The last chapter ended with a question about the origin of the superior men, the philosopher kings, or the inheritors of the earth. These are the monikers Confucius, Plato, and Gülen respectively give to their versions of the ideal human who is to lead or influence society if, as a whole, it is to be good and just. Where are these people? How do we get them? Where do we find them? The answer, of course, is obvious if not comforting. We are them, or we are to become them. The goal of all three systems is for all people to actualize the human ideal in themselves as much as possible. The phrase "as much as possible," however, acknowledges that many people, even most perhaps, will not achieve this high level of human possibility. As we saw early in the last chapter, Confucius, Plato, and Gülen all mark clearly the distinction between the sighted and the blind, between the masses of common people fixated on mundane realities and the few who seek after higher things. So while all have the potential to become ideal people because of their inherent human nature, most will not, or will only in partial or piecemeal ways. For those who do come to actualize the human ideal, the question still remains: how did they do it? What methods or mechanisms put them in a position to cultivate themselves to such a degree? The answer is the same from all three of our trialogue participants: through education. Education is the general ground upon which rests any effort to actualize full or ideal humanity. Confucius, Plato, and Gülen each articulate specific theories of education in their respective worldviews, so much so that without the education component, the entire edifice of the system falls. Moreover, each of them articulates a specific kind of education that will bring about or maximize the highest possibility of attaining the kind of human cultivation of character that each of them seeks. In short, for Confucius, Plato, and Gülen, rigorous and guided education is the cornerstone of development of the highest human ideal. Therefore, social structures must be ordered fundamentally around the mechanisms of this education in order for society to generate from within itself its own highest and best leaders. As we saw in the previous chapter, Confucianism exists as a socio-political theory as much or more than as a religious philosophy, as he articulates the distinction between the masses on the one hand and the superior man or gentleman on the other. Confucius advances his view that harmony in human social and political life occurs when superior men govern. Following this claim, Confucianism exists through the centuries in China as a philosophical theory of social and political development that educates men to prepare them for varying levels of government service, all the way to being principal advisors to the emperor. Confucius, however, concerned himself with people as a whole, not only with would-be rulers and with society as a whole. David Hinton, in the introduction to his translation of The Analects, explains that for Confucius, ritual involved far more than simply saying the proper words to an elder or wearing the proper color during a festival season. Ritual involves one's proper posture inside a web of relationships that comprise human life. Relationships with parents, siblings, older relatives, imperial authorities, venerable historical texts, and so on. Living a life of li, or ritual propriety, in this sense naturally involves a broad set of egalitarian principles with which Confucius primarily was concerned. Principles like social justice, governance in accord with what is good for society, not for the rulers alone, and the role of intellectuals play in guiding society and critiquing its governors. Hinton says, "For Confucius, the ritual community depends upon these egalitarian elements, and they depend ultimately on the education and cultivation of the community members. To call Confucius's contribution in this regard epochal would be an understatement. He was China's first professional teacher, founding the idea of a broad moral education, and in addition, he established the classic texts that defined the essential content of that education. As if that weren't enough, he also established the enduring principle of egalitarian education, that all people should receive some form of education, that this is necessary for the health of a moral community. He focused his attention on the education of the intellectuals, which was of necessity much more exhaustive than that of the masses, but he thought even this education should be available to any who seek it, however humble their origins. In fact, not only was the master himself from a relatively humble background, nearly all his disciples were as well. The Confucian commitment to education is, in fact, a commitment to the human, to human beings in themselves and in community, and to humaneness as the chief moral virtue that both defines what it means to be a human being and anchors a good, stable society. Without this basic development, society simply does not work because the people who comprise it function barely at the level called human. Commentators both inside and outside the Chinese tradition routinely refer to Confucian superior men as scholars because of the exacting educational regimen the men had to master in order to achieve any rank at all in civil service. Moreover, for Confucius, learning is central to all virtue. The Analects tell us, "The master asked, 'Have you heard of the 6 precepts and their 6 deceptions?' 'No,' replied Adept Lu. 'Then sit, and I'll tell you,' said the master. 'To love humanity without loving learning, that's the deception of foolishness. To love wisdom without loving learning, that's the deception of dissipation. To love sincerity without loving learning, that's the deception of subterfuge. To love veracity without loving learning, that the deception of intolerance. To love courage without loving learning, that's the deception of confusion. And to love determination without loving learning, that's the deception of recklessness." Here, Confucius explains that to strive to actualize any of the virtues of life and service without learning is a variety of deception. The virtues somehow do not become virtuous without being accompanied by, or acquired through, education or learning. Elsewhere in The Analects, Confucius says, "I've spent days without food and nights without sleep, hoping to purify thought and clarify mind, but it's never done much good. Such practices, they're nothing like devoted study." Devoted study and learning develop the moral virtues of cleanliness of heart and mind. Traditional ascetic practices such as fasting or sleep deprivation are ineffective. Confucian superior men, or gentlemen, were master students and practitioners of what later came to be called the Confucian classics, or the canon of the literati. The texts included in the canon expanded over time, but the oldest, most venerable portion of the canon, which often bears the title of scripture, includes 5 texts: Shu Jing, Book of History; Shi Jing, Book of Songs; Yi Jing, Book of Changes; Chuun Chui, Springs and Autumns; and Li Jing, Book of Ritual. Confucian superior men were scholars whose mastery of the content of these texts and others qualified them as worthy to serve as government officials, provincial governors, and imperial advisors. The various texts of the Confucian canon provide extensive instruction on the cultivation of character aligned with the classic virtues of humaneness, propriety, prudence, uprightness, incorruptibility, frugality, filial piety, benevolence, discipline, and sincerity. Additionally, they taught excellence in music, poetry, and other knowledge. In The Analects, we read, "The master said, 'How is it, my little ones, that none of you study the songs? Through the songs, you can inspire people to turn their gaze inward, bring people together, and give voices to their grievances. Through them you serve your father when home and your sovereign when away, and you learn the names of countless birds and animals and plants.'" Then the master said to his son Po Yu, "Have you worked through the Chao Nan and the Shao Nan? Until you've worked through at least them, you'll live as if you stood facing a wall." Here we see that the mastery of the Book of Songs, that is, music and poetry, is vital to self-development, leadership, and service of both family and emperor. Without this cultivation, life is like facing a wall. The resonance with Plato's allegory of the cave is obvious here. Without mastery of at least the first sections of the Book of Songs, the would-be superior man is like one of Plato's cave dwellers, fixed in position staring at the wall of shadows as if it is the culmination of all reality. Only through study is one able to turn away from the wall and go toward the light of knowledge. Only those with knowledge can fulfill society's need for strong families, good governors, and a wisely advised emperor. Without these things, society devolves into chaos. The educational path through the classics cultivated a mastery of more than merely the art or science of governing. Confucian education was not so narrowly defined. As indicated by even the titles of the classics themselves, Confucian scholars were trained in a variety of disciplines, such as poetry, music, history, and ritual, which on the surface might not seem integral to education and good governance. Scholars were master musicians on a variety of instruments, excelled in poetry composition and recitation, and were highly skilled calligraphers, just to list a few areas of expertise. The Confucian theory argues that such education and training cultivates character in a complex and desirable way. We see a hint of this in a passage from the Analects. The master said, "When I keep saying ritual, ritual, do you think I'm just ranting about jade and silk? And when I keep saying music, music, do you think I'm just ranting about bells and drums?" The implication here is that more is being taught than simply the mechanics of ritual or music. Certainly, ritual and music have inherent value that alone would encourage study and mastery of them, but Confucius suggests here that mastery of these accomplishes something else as well, beyond the level of propriety in dress or playing of instruments. The passage quoted earlier about the Book of Songs contains a similar suggestion, namely that learning music provides an education beyond the mere performance of songs or the history of musical tradition. Here we get a glimpse of what Confucius claims about human nature and its depths. Mastery in music, poetry, and ritual provides a mechanical mastery of instruments, words, and actions, to be sure, which is useful on its own. At a deeper level, however, mastery in these subjects cultivates a humaneness of character that is of the greatest importance. Music opens up a part of the human spirit that nothing else can. To be able to both play and hear music at a high level demands the fine, exquisite cultivation of that innermost part of human nature. The same applies to poetry or calligraphy. Both demand increasingly subtle and fine powers of perception and expression, at the level of the mechanics of the hand or speaking voice, and at the level of the soul. This is the point for Confucius. Superior men become superior human beings through the cultivation of this ever more pristine capacity within themselves, a capacity which they share with all human beings, but which they alone, through their education and discipline, actualize in themselves. As they develop themselves in these areas, their influence on others grows because all human beings, cultivated or not, possess a nature that responds to music and other beauty. As the passage above indicates, music prompts people to look inside themselves, to come together with others, and to express their feelings. Scholars with musical mastery inspire these in people. This inspirational power comprises part of their day, discussed in the previous chapter. Confucian superior men exemplified the human intellectual and moral ideal of Chinese thought for centuries, even until Chairman Mao and communism. These masters of literary education and moral development defined true humanity in its most august, exalted form, and the image that emerges of them is one of high intellectual and artistic refinement through cultivation of personality, exquisite propriety and form, and supreme moral elegance. Moreover, they achieved this through devoted study and tireless practice, that is, on their own strength. Many humanistic systems prioritize, and this one does, what human beings can accomplish through their own efforts as opposed to assistance from God or fate. Confucius tells us that basic human nature is the same in everyone. What distinguishes people eventually is study and practice, which they do on their own through their own determination. Such people are the rightful owners of the title superior men, and others who do not achieve such distinction should be grateful to be governed by them and to have them as examples of proper human life and behavior. Indeed, according to Confucius, a superior man's character exerts a kind of moral force on those around him, such that they feel themselves wanting to do noble actions, or at least refrain from base ones. These are people who not only enhance their own individual lives, they enhance life itself for all those near them through their example and their governance. As the ideal human actualized in social and political life, they testify to the power of education and cultivation in human life. Confucian superior men, were they to be transported across time and space to Plato's ideal republic, would find themselves welcomed and encouraged to take their place among the guardians. As we saw in the previous chapter, both versions of the idealized human being involve high moral development and a component of service to society through governance. What also unites them is the belief that only those proven fit to govern should actually govern. Therefore, the political model proposed by both philosophies is meritocracy, as opposed to a pure-blood aristocracy. Those with merit should govern, and those without merit should be governed, or helped to govern themselves. Merit is determined through the educational system, so the path to guardianship in Plato's ideal republic, as in the Confucian path to government service, requires substantial formal education and cultivation. Socrates' ideas about education for the guardians, as well as for other roles in a well-ordered society, are spread throughout the entirety of the Republic. Books 2 and 3 provide substantial conversations about specific components of educational curricula. Later books delve into the moral benefits of mathematical education, and even later sections explain Socrates' notion of the meritocracy by contrasting it with 4 aberrant forms of government, namely timocracy, oligarchy, radical democracy, and tyranny. To interpret all these sections in detail goes beyond the scope of the analysis here. Instead, I offer here a synthesis of Socrates' basic understanding of the well-ordered state, the guardians who govern it, and how these guardians are to be identified and cultivated as guardians for the good of the society as a whole. Perhaps the best place to begin in this synthesis is with Socrates' Myth of the Metals in Book 3. Scholars of religion point to the myth of the metals as indicative of Plato's functional theory of religion. That is, religious myth and story serve a useful function in society, whether or not they are factually or historically true. The truths carried in myth or story are metaphysical or philosophical truths that obtain despite the lack of factuality in the story itself. Socrates' metals story is such a myth, a fantastic imaginative origin myth that illustrates a philosophical truth about reality. In this case, about the differences in human gifts and abilities, or what Socrates refers to as people's natural abilities. The myth goes like this. All human beings have Mother Earth as their common source. However, the gods placed metals of gold, silver, and iron into the earth, such that while all people emerge from the same source, they are differentiated from each other by containing within themselves gold, silver, or iron. Some people contain, or are, gold, while others are silver or iron. So the myth explains in story form a truth that occurs in human reality. The mixture of metals across common humanity provides for the fact that while 2 gold parents most likely will give birth to gold offspring, they might have silver or iron offspring. No guarantee exists that gold will produce gold or silver produce silver. Gold might produce silver, and iron may produce gold. In Socrates' scheme, the guardians are gold, the soldiers are silver, and the craftsmen and farmers are iron. All roles are necessary and form part of the complete whole of society, but a hierarchy exists inside the basic egalitarianism. The gold are to govern all the rest, including themselves. Only those who exhibit gold characteristics are to govern, Those who exhibit silver or iron must perform the social tasks fitted to those metals. Therefore, society must be structured to pay attention to the particular metals in each person, so that those who display gold are not put into iron professions, and those who display iron are not put into gold professions. Chaos comes when people are placed in positions, work, or responsibility that does not fit their inherent natures or dispositions. People's natural metal, their natural talents and gifts, must be discerned and cultivated properly for the good ordering of all society. This is done through education. Throughout the Republic, Socrates talks about the scrutiny and testing that people must endure so that supervisors can determine their mettle, or so that, once confirmed, the mettle in a person is developed and actualized fully. Everyone receives a basic education, but then moves eventually into specialized studies once their natural abilities and dispositions come into view. At every level, people receive the education designed to bring out the best humanity in them, as well as the fullest expression of their mettle. The best education also achieves a balance between the soul and the body. Socrates explains in Book 3 that those who receive excessive training in music and poetry at the expense of physical or athletic training become soft, feeble, and spiritless. Conversely, those who receive only athletic education without cultivation of the soul for beauty become aggressive and seek to address every issue with violence and savagery. Human beings are multifaceted and must be educated as such to achieve their fullest potential as humans and as beings with particular gifts or metals unique to them. Those with the gifts for guardianship, of course, receive the most strenuous and highly advanced education because the responsibility for the governance of the entire state rests on their shoulders. Socrates spends most of Book 2 and 3 discussing the kind of education the guardians must receive. These sections are some of the most debated passages in the Republic, because Socrates calls for a rigid and carefully constructed educational curriculum for guardians that appears to be censored and limiting to many living in the contemporary West. Socrates claims in these sections that the guardians must not be exposed to certain kinds of literature, music, or playwriting because they tend to create certain qualities of the soul that ultimately undermine the guardian's ability to discern the good and govern properly. Many classic works of the ancient Greek world, such as the works of Homer and Hesiod, are not among what is allowed for the guardians because they portray positively heroes like Achilles or even the gods behaving in less than positive ways. Certain roles in dramatic works are off limits to the would-be guardians because to play such roles in a theater production would involve them imitating or mimicking immoral or problematic behaviors, and this could develop in their souls a capacity for such behaviors. The souls of the guardians must be safeguarded and cultivated carefully from early childhood so that in their inmost being they are attuned to goodness, beauty, order, and justice. Their role as guardians demands this quality of soul, and all care must be taken to create that capacity in them from the beginning and to preserve it once cultivated. In Book 2, Socrates says of the young guardians, "At this tender age, they are the most impressionable and therefore most likely to adopt any and all models set before them." Later, he defends censorship of certain poetry and other artistic expression. "In this way, we could protect our guardians from growing up in the presence of evil, in a veritable pasture of poisonous herbs where by grazing at will, little by little and day by day, they should unwittingly accumulate a huge mass of corruption in their souls." At all times, educators are mindful that it is the soul of people, especially of the guardians, which is being cultivated. Socrates claims that because education happens at the level of the soul, music and arts education is perhaps the most important component of the curriculum. He explains to his student Glaucon, "That is why education in poetry and music is first in importance, Glaucon. Rhythm and harmonies have the greatest influence on the soul. They penetrate into its innermost regions and there hold fast. If the soul is rightly trained, they bring grace. If not, they bring the contrary. One who is properly educated in these matters would most quickly perceive and deplore the absence or perversion of beauty in art or nature. With true good taste, he would instead delight in beautiful things, praising them and welcoming them into his soul. He would nourish them and would himself come to be beautiful and good. While still young and still unable to understand why, he will reject and hate what is ugly. Then, later, when reason comes to one so educated, his affinity for what is good and beautiful will lead him to recognize and welcome her. The soul is the point here, or the inner self, what some today might be more inclined to call character. This must be developed at every point, through every access, and in every component of the curriculum. Like Confucian scholars, Socrates' guardians receive intensive education in many disciplines, including music, poetry, gymnastics, mathematics, and many other areas, all with the objective of raising individuals attuned in their deepest selves to justice, goodness, and harmony. Only such individuals can be trusted with guardianship of the entire state. Only with such people at its helm does the ship of state sail safely in the often rough waters of the world. Such an understanding of education for all people, especially the guardians, comes to form a central definition for justice according to Socrates, which is a preoccupation of the entire conversation in The Republic. From Book 1 onward, the discussion returns again and again to the concept of justice and how to define it. Toward the end of Book 4, after spending 2 entire books on guardian education, Socrates asserts a definition of justice completely intertwined with the model of education he has elucidated. He says, "Then justice is nothing else than the power that brings forth well-governed men and well-governed cities. The reality is that justice is not a matter of external behavior, but the way a man privately and truly governs himself. The just man does not permit the various parts of his soul to interfere with one another or usurp each other's functions. He has set his own life in order. He is his own master and his own law. He has become a friend to himself. He will have brought into tune the 3 parts of his soul, high, middle, and low, like the 3 major notes of a musical scale and all the intervals between. When he has brought all this together in temperance and harmony, he will have made himself one man instead of many. Only then will he be ready to do whatever he does in society, making money, training the body, involving himself in politics or in business transactions. In all the public activities in which he is engaged, he will call just and beautiful only that conduct which harmonizes with and preserves his own inner order, which we have just described. And the knowledge that understands the meaning and importance of such conduct he will call wisdom." Justice itself, then, depends on people throughout the various professions and roles in society who have been educated since childhood on the precepts of beauty and goodness. Moreover, the society that depends on such people to govern it must itself be structured to generate those self-same types of people for its furtherance, thus the central role education plays in society. Education is the mechanism through which is developed the highest and best of human capacity, and the best forms of education are those that, no matter what their immediate subject matter, have as their chief objective the cultivation of the human soul attuned to justice, beauty, and goodness. Without such individuals at all its levels, society is lost. Gülen, from within an Islamic perspective, many centuries removed from both Confucius and Socrates, presents a largely resonant theory of education, the soul, and human development. He, like his ancient colleagues, understands the human self as a being comprised of corporeal, mental, and spiritual components. Each of these components must be developed properly to achieve full human potential, and this development occurs through education. Gülen explains, "We are creatures comprised of not only a body or mind or feelings or spirit, rather, we are harmonious compositions of all of these elements. Each of us is a body writhing in a net of needs, as well as a mind that has more subtle and vital needs than the body, and is driven by anxieties about the past and future. Moreover, each person is a creature of feelings that cannot be satisfied by the mind and a creature of spirit, through which we acquire our essential human identity. Each individual is all of these. When a man or a woman, around whom all systems and efforts revolve, is considered and evaluated as a creature with all these aspects, and when all our needs are fulfilled, we will reach true happiness. At this point, true human progress and evolvement in relation to our essential being is only possible with education. Here we see resonance with Socrates' definition of the human self with three distinct parts: the mind or soul, the drives, and the body. All the parts must be developed properly and must function in their proper order within a person in order for full human actualization. Gülen expresses a similar sentiment in this passage, namely that each man or woman is a complex of components that must be developed in themselves and must be organized harmoniously within the self for human progress to occur. This passage and others like it form part of a larger discussion of history in which Gülen traces the development of civilizations both East and West. He argues that although Western civilization has dominated the world for the last several centuries and has provided the leading edge in science and technology, the world view of the modern West is materialistic and thus lacking. That is, the Western perspective views human beings in largely materialistic terms and seeks to fulfill human achievement in those reduced terms. Sacrificed in such an approach are the other dimensions of human being, which are spiritual, and this sacrifice has created many social crises. Part of Gülen's vision for the future involves combining the best of Western culture, which is scientific and technological, with the best of Eastern culture, which is spiritual and moral, in order to create a more fully evolved and holistic human culture that will take all reality into a new era. For Gülen, as for Socrates and Confucius, no individual or society reaches its fullest potential without education. Gülen sees education as the means by which people become the true beings God created them to be. Thus, to become educated is life's most important task. He says, "The main duty and purpose of human life is to seek understanding. The effort of doing so, known as education, is a perfecting process through which we earn, in the spiritual, intellectual, and physical dimensions of our beings, the rank appointed for us as the perfect pattern of creation. Our principal duty in life is to acquire perfection and purity in our thinking, perceptions, and belief, by fulfilling our duty of servanthood to the Creator, nourisher, and protector, and by penetrating the mystery of creation through our potential and abilities, we seek to attain the rank of true humanity and become worthy of a blissful, eternal life in another, exalted world." Here, Gülen places learning and education at the most fundamental level of human purpose. In a phrase, the purpose of human life is to become fully human, and that happens through learning and knowledge. Gülen, as a Muslim, places this within the larger context of service to God, but one could place it just as easily into a more Aristotelian context in which the purpose or function of everything is to be itself fully and perfectly, and everything is naturally endowed with the internal components and capacities to be perfectly itself given the proper context. Human beings are born with the capacity to become fully human, and for Gülen, as for Aristotle, Socrates, Confucius, and many others, the inborn mechanism for becoming fully human is our capacity to learn through education. Gülen says, "Since real life is only possible through knowledge, those who have neglected learning and teaching are considered to be dead, even when they are biologically alive. We are created to learn and to communicate what we have learned to others." Gülen speaks throughout his work about the need for general education for all people in order for a civilization to function. He claims that people are only civilized to the extent that they are educated, especially in the traditional values of a particular culture. Cohesion in life at all levels comes via education of all citizens of a nation or state in a common worldview and core of values. The transnational Gülen movement, however, focuses on education far beyond a given set of cultural values or norms. The nearly 1,000 schools, at the time of this writing, run by Gülen movement participants, which are operating all over the world, educate children and young adults in the full range of academic disciplines: science, mathematics, history, language, literature, social or cultural studies, art, music, and more. People inspired by Gülen's teachings opened schools in Turkey after the government allowed the operating of private schools as long as they adhered to a state-mandated curriculum and submitted themselves to state review. Schools set up by Gülen movement participants in other countries operate with the same basic educational approach as the schools in Turkey, but with increasing influence of the indigenous country's national culture and values. Gülen himself has very little, if any, contact with the schools, and in fact is not even aware of the exact number of schools or even their names. His own early example as an educator, as well as his ideas about education, global community, human progress, and so on, have simply inspired a generation of people to raise up schools all over Turkey, Central Asia, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere to combat the perennial problems of ignorance, poverty, and schism. The basic structure and character of the schools is such that they are financed by voluntary organizations, community groups, and student fees. Local administrators assist with infrastructure, and the teachers work within a mindset of service to others, often for low salaries. As I mentioned in the introduction to this book, I have visited many of these schools throughout Turkey and have met with the sponsors of the schools, that is, the local businessmen and local community leaders who joined together to create the schools in their respective regions. In many instances, the schools are the most modern architectural structure in the area. The walls of the school are lined with photographs of students receiving medals at various national and international academic competitions and being visited by an array of Turkish government ministers and members of parliament. The classroom, laboratory, and office facilities are highly functional and professional-looking, even when being used by hundreds of excited students. The students are bright, outgoing, and eager to practice their English with American visitors. The principals, administrators, and teachers are focused, dedicated, and proud of their schools and students, and many of them live on the premises with the students in the schools that offer boarding. I shared meals with many Turkish families who send their children to these schools, and I asked them the same question in each city, each region. Why do you send your children to this school? The answer was the same every time. They send them because of the dedication of the teachers, the quality of the curriculum, and the overall vision that the school, through its teachers, promotes with regard to global humanity, education, tolerance, and dialogue. Gülen's educational vision involves not only schools, but also families, communities, and media. All major components of society must be aligned in the work of educating the youth in all beneficial knowledge. The stakes are very high because the future of any nation or civilization depends on its youth. Gülen says, "People who want to guarantee their future cannot be indifferent to how their children are educated. The family, school, environment, and mass media should all cooperate to ensure the desired result. In particular, the mass media should contribute to the education of the young generation by following the education policy approved by the community. The school must be as perfect as possible with respect to its curriculum, the scientific and moral standards of the teachers, and its physical conditions. The family must provide the necessary warmth and atmosphere in which to raise children." Here, we see Gülen expressing concerns highly resonant with those Socrates expresses in the Republic. As we saw above, Socrates goes so far as to argue for censorship of the poets and musicians, ancient Greece's mass media, so that the guardians are exposed only to artistic expression that will nurture their souls. While Gülen nowhere advocates censorship in the way Socrates does, he shares with Socrates a general concern for proper education in order to achieve the fullest actualization of humanity, which includes the support of parents and the community, the environment of the school, the topics taught, and the moral standards of the teachers. We can further see the importance of education for all of society when Gülen speaks of the role of consultation in Islam in particular, and in society at large. He devotes an entire chapter to the subject in The Statue of Our Souls, and in this chapter, Gülen clearly delineates the vital role that highly educated people play in the furtherance of society and the kinds of education needed for today's globalized world. He begins by quoting a passage from the Quran that places conducting affairs by mutual consultation in the same category as performing regular prayers. He goes on to cite the central importance that consultation has within Islam, so much so that a community without it is not really Muslim in the full sense. He continues by explaining how it works in Muslim society. Consultation is one of the prime dynamics which keep the Islamic order standing as a system. To consultation belongs the most important mission and duty of resolving affairs concerning the individual and the community, the people and the state, science and knowledge, and economics and sociology, unless, of course, there is a nas, divine decree, a verse of the Quran or a command from the Prophet, decisive on any point in canon law, with a clear meaning on these matters. Even rulers must conduct affairs using consultation. Consultation is the method by which the ruler or rulers make the decisions that impact virtually every area of life, from the individual to the communal. Gülen spends several pages outlining the scriptural passages that support consultation and explaining the history of its use in Islam, and he reviews established guidelines for the practice. He then comes to the central question of who is fit for consultation, with whom should rulers consult, who is qualified to serve as a consultant. Gülen answers, since the matters presented for deliberation require a great degree of knowledge, experience, and expertise, a consultation committee must be comprised of people who are distinguished for such qualities. This can only be a committee of people of high caliber, who are able to resolve many matters. Especially today, as life has become more intricate and complicated, as the world has globalized and every problem has become an all-encompassing planetary problem, it is vital that those competent in natural sciences, engineering, and technology, which are most of the time considered to be good and proper by Muslims, should participate alongside those men of high caliber who know Islamic essence, reality, spirit, and sciences. Consultation can be carried out with qualified people from the different worldly sciences, knowledge, and other required fields, insofar as decisions taken are supervised by the religious authorities for the compatibility or accord of what they suggest with Islam. In this passage, we begin to see the high standard people have to meet in order to function as consultants. Important to remember is that Gülen articulates a vision for an Islamic society, which he believes is the best kind of society. Whether one agrees with him or not is irrelevant. Our point here is that within his envisioned society, education is absolutely vital for all people to attain the basics of human existence. Moreover, high levels of education are needed by an elite cadre of individuals who are to serve as consultants to rulers on particular issues, or who may serve as rulers themselves in some capacity. Gülen explains further. According to different circumstances and eras, the conduct and composition of the consultative committee might change, but the qualifications and the attributes of those select people, such as people from knowledge, justice, social education and experience, wisdom and sagacity, must never change. More often than not, these consultants will be the ideal humans or people of heart Gülen describes elsewhere in his work and that we discussed in the previous chapter. The consultants are those the schools inspired by Gülen are designed to educate, young people who will go into the world with a virtuous character as well as a high level of academic training in their various professions. Some of those young people will achieve extraordinary levels of success and wisdom and will be called upon to serve as consultants. In doing so, they will be the generation of ideal people who are to usher in a new social reality that will mend the false bifurcation between science and religion, that will mesh East and West, and that will offer a whole new way of life to the world. For Gülen, there is no other way to structure society that deserves to be called human, and certainly no other way that can be called Islamic. Human beings have within them the capacities to achieve perfection as humans, and those who internalize and actualize that perfection in themselves must influence society as rulers or consultants or grassroots community leaders. For any of these things to happen, people must be educated in an intentional, proper way. The schools of the transnational Gülen movement are contemporary initiatives in this endeavor, and they seek to educate their youth from all sectors of society to become highly trained and virtuous people who, like Confucian superior men, influence everything and everyone around them with the force, day, of their knowledge, goodness, and beauty. Each of our trialogue participants presents a powerful vision of what is possible on the human, social, and political level. The power of this vision is due in no small part to the spiritual or non-material quality that they all, in their own way and within their own cultural and linguistic rubrics, acknowledge as a central part of humanness. This soul quality is what, in their respective views, distinguishes humans from the rest of the animal creation. All three firmly believe in our inherent powers to develop our inborn capacities for human perfection, although all three acknowledge that many people will never use these powers. Their belief in this power, used or not, is what makes Confucius, Socrates, and Gülen humanists in the broad sense of the term. They believe in human power to become fully and ideally human. Further, because people can do it, they must do it. These men are not fatalists or determinists. They do not see people individually or collectively as pawns of history or of fate. Gülen in particular, even taking into account his view of an all-powerful, all-knowing God, exhorts his readers to take responsibility for themselves and for the world. The challenge of responsibility is a great challenge for any age, but perhaps our current age of rapid change and mass violence calls out for us to meet it more than any other. We turn now in the next chapter to this theme of responsibility.